Hello class, welcome to section 2036 part 2. In the last video we left off with section 2036 part 1 discussing problems that have been encountered with respect to litigation concerning section 2036, and we discussed how this probably had a lot to do with the fact that the control over the income means the whole thing gets pulled back into the estate. So one of the areas that make up problems encountered with Section 2036 is with respect to what it means to have full and adequate consideration. So what is a transfer for full and adequate consideration? As you can see in this illustration, if you have D selling the remainder value of the trust for the actuarial value, then what's going to happen is this is going to help to keep the property from being pulled back into D's estate under Section 2036. Now, if we expand on this first part of the example and say that the value of the trust that D set up is $1 million, and if the remainder of the trust is sold, basically 2x for $200,000, the question to ask is, would the $200 be included in D's estate when he dies? And the answer is yes, if the $200,000 does not represent full and adequate consideration for the interest. Now, if on the other hand, X transfers $200,000 to D as full and adequate consideration. So in this case, it's considered as full and adequate consideration for the remainder. Then when X dies, and if X's payment, let's change it. If X's payment does not actually represent the full and adequate consideration for money's worth, the entire amount of the trust is going to be pulled back into D's estate. So there could be consequences for not selling the remainder for full and adequate consideration for money or money's worth. So the courts have held that a payment for the remainder for full and adequate consideration for money and money's worth is sufficient to keep the property out of the decedent's estate. And a payment of the actuarial value of the remainder is considered received for full and adequate consideration. Now, this is different from the determination regarding if a bona fide sale occurred, because a bona fide sale is considered as occurring as long as X used its own consideration with no help from, say, D. If that's the case, you have a bona fide sale, and this is going to come into play dealing with family limited partnerships. Another area to consider is the reciprocal trust doctrine. So before we look at the next example, in a simple setup where D sets up a trust and there's income, say, to W, remainder to X, since W only had an income interest in that particular trust that was gifted from D, when W dies, there is nothing that's going to be included in X's estate, and that's because there's no retained income interest. So now we're going to change it up a little bit so that you can see how a reciprocal trust works. So on the next example, what occurs here is D makes a transfer in trust and into this trust, and the income in the trust is going to W and the remainder is going to X. At the same time, or very near to that same time, W makes a transfer into this trust. And in this other trust, income goes to D and the remainder goes to Y. So if we look at these transactions separately, for instance, if these weren't occurring together, if D just set up this trust and you have income going to W and remainder to X, then D has nothing to include in his estate, because what's occurred here is D has not retained any interest. And remember, to retain interest, that you have to have the grantor who is retaining some kind of interest in the trust, and this doesn't occur if you only look at this transaction here. So, but if we put the transactions together as a whole, the situation changes. For example, so in this situation, looking at it as a whole, we're actually having two things that are occurring. W setting it up so that the income goes to D, D setting it up so income goes to W. And in a case called the Estate of Grace, it was ruled that if the trusts are interrelated, in that if D sets up a trust for W's benefit as consideration for W setting up the trust for D's benefit, in this case, D will be viewed as the grantor of W's trust, and W will be viewed as the grantor of D's trust, which means that D and W have retained income interest, which causes the value at D's death to be pulled back into D's estate. The nature of this type of transaction is referred to as the reciprocal trust doctrine. This is a substance versus form issue, basically. And the finding that we need to make is if the trust is a reciprocal trust. So the fact that a trust is merely created around the same time as another related trust may be a situation where it could be considered a reciprocal trust. So that's all I wanted to relay with this particular illustration. So next, section 2036B is a rule concerning controlled trusts. And basically what it says is if the decedent has retained the right to vote shares in a controlled corporation, and you can ignore this illustration that's on the screen, then that retained right to vote is enough to cause the property to be pulled back into the decedent's gross estate. And control is considered having at least a 20% ownership of the corporation for this purpose. So an interesting case is the estate of Barlow. And this is where the taxpayer made a gift of a farm and leased it back at fair rental value. So I'm just getting into some other issues that you would encounter. And this would be called a gift lease back. The court determined that nothing needed to be included in the decedent's estate. And that was a situation where the donor decedent used the property before and after the transfer, but this wasn't problematic by virtue of the fact that the decedent was paying rent. So now you need to keep this in mind. This means that the decedent is paying rent and getting the property out of his estate by paying that rent without the need to treat that income as coming out of his estate as a gift. So in this case, the estate is basically shrinking, and that's a good deal for planning purposes, at least. And then the final thing that I want to go over again is that if you have a power or retention of a power to remove a trustee and make yourself a trustee, say when the power is only to replace one independent trustee with another independent trustee, it will not pull the property back into the decedent's estate. And that's with this particular context, and the IRS has conceded on this issue. So again, that's where you're removing a trustee that's an independent trustee with another independent trustee. So that's it for section 2036.